Welcome back to the Teams Insider podcast. You know, we like to have the customer perspective on the podcast. And this was a really good conversation with Dan Hall, who is IT collaboration owner at a manufacturing company. We got into a little bit of the history of his experience moving from a standard telephony system to Teams. And we also got into Android and Android lifecycle and the impacts on choosing room devices and phones, and even a little bit of SIP devices and BYOD. Really hope you enjoy this conversation. Many thanks to Dan for making the time, and also many thanks to Luware, the sponsor of this podcast. Really appreciate their support of everything we're doing at Empowering Cloud. Hope you enjoy the show. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Exciting one this week. I've got Dan Hall. Dan Hall works at a little bit of a different company. I typically talk to kind of knowledge workery type companies. Dan Hall is IT collaboration solution owner at a large manufacturing organisation, global reach. I think, Dan, is your HQ London?
Well, office in London, but our headquarters is actually based out of Florida.
Okay, cool. So, you're around just outside London, aren't you?
That's right. I'm down on the south coast.
Awesome. Well, thanks for reaching out. You reached out via the newsletter, and we ended up chatting. So I appreciate you reaching out and coming on the show. So maybe you give the audience a little bit of a background about you and your role and your kind of Link, Skype, now Teams journey as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, so initially we had on-premise via PBXs, and everybody had desk phones, and was using Skype for business. And then we was looking to modernize that. And I think our journey started in about 2018 towards 2019, and we chose Teams as our platform. So we was moving away from on-premise devices to cloud, giving people headsets, but being in a manufacturing organization, of course, we've still got common area phones. And the big requirement of that was that the phones needed push buttons. So we picked a particular desk phone that's Teams certified that had push buttons, and we carried on that experience. But since then, Teams is our collaboration platform of choice. So I look after all of Microsoft Teams and everything that comes with it. So that includes voice, conference rooms, etc.
So you cover both kind of, in some organization it ends up split, like there's like the kind of collaboration governance data bit of Teams, and then there's the UC rooms devices bit, but your role spans both those.
It's quite broad. It's the whole suite, but we have particular departments that look after particular sections of that. But
Awesome.
It's me that oversees it.
And how was the journey? Again, I talked to lots of kind of, bank, FinServ, legal, manufacturing. I feel like you have more specific requirements. You mentioned IP phones there, different use cases. How was it going from a classic of IPBX to cloud and Teams phone?
Well, I think the biggest challenge was change management, because we're going from a simple messaging platform, Skype for Business. We have desk phones on people's desks that are quite simple to use. And we're kind of bringing all the functionality of Teams into play as well. So it's kind of like a big change. And going from a handset to a headset is, it takes a little bit of adjustment to get to. But once you tackle that, and then the capabilities pay off. And like I say, we was pushing through our journey pre-COVID. And then as soon as kind of like the COVID lockdowns hit, we was close to the end of our implementation. So it was in a good place already. And it was quite interesting to see, the acceleration of adoption of the platform. We had the ability to move people out of the office, whether they're customer services, into homes, and then carry on still working.
Yeah, I think that COVID period is when a lot of people realized the value of cloud, and like it wasn't flawless. Like the big cloud providers had some scaling challenges as well, but the fact that you could be like, it's your problem now to suddenly go from 10% usage to 100% usage, and we as internal IT don't have to worry about that, was quite a blessing for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, revolutionise the way we work.
Awesome. So today you're 100% Teams phone, or is there still some Avaya knocking around?
No, 100% Teams phone. We do have a fair amount of analog out there as well, which we've converted to ATA using media packs, and then they effectively connect back to the cloud that way. Yeah, everything's fully in the cloud. We still do have one SBC out there where we can't get cloud calling plans, but as soon as that's available, that will be ripped out as well.
Awesome. What about, we didn't talk about this before, but what about contact center? Is that a different platform? What do you
No,
think
I
there?
say we're fully Teams there as well. We'd call it contact center light, I guess. We do have, as I mentioned, we've got customer services and consumer services. We've managed to fully put all of that into Teams. There is a
Amazing.
little bit of missing capability there, which looks like Microsoft are addressing very soon with the Queues app. Where you can sort of see how many callers are in the queue and things like that. That has been missing since we had Avaya, but it looks like there are options to cover those gaps.
Yeah, they're putting a lot of effort into the Queues app, so definitely for the price and the functionality, that looks pretty interesting. I'm looking forward to that's coming out kind of August, September time, so we'll see how that lands with people.
Yeah, we've been looking at the customer preview of that and been helping out with the developments, but it should be GA anytime soon now.
Nice. Cool. So the primary thing we wanted to jump on and talk about on this pod was devices and Android and kind of life cycle. To get everybody up to speed who's listening to the pod, and we'll try and get this out relatively quickly. Microsoft are changing some backend infrastructure. They're depreciating a particular service, and that has had a knock-on effect on some of the older Android-based phones. So the phones that are out of support will no longer work with relatively short notice, knowing that they wouldn't work. But it kind of sparks a bigger conversation. I think that's where we should start, Dan, about how Android works and how the life cycle works. And then you're very close to this, obviously, with your devices. So where's the best place to start?
Oh, blimey, it's a story this. Yeah, so I guess really we'll start by saying that, it was end of June that Microsoft announced in the message center that they're going to be deprecating a messaging services for that would impact some of the older Teams devices running Android. And if you like us that were implementing Teams back in 2020, it's likely that those devices are going to be impacted. And in the previous world, when you had on-premise PBXs and desk phones, you may not even have a life cycle refresh for a desk phone handset. Maybe you run it till it breaks, or have at least maybe 8 years until you think about replacing them all. But it's kind of sparked out a bit of a debate. So the message center articles say that, like I say, published in June, initially said that the service is going to depreciate end of July. So it gives us a very small amount of time to react, and we did react very quickly. Since then they've extended that deadline to end of September, but for us at least, we've gone ahead and replaced all of those phones that have been impacted. But
and you're definitely not the only customer impacted. I'm talking to 2 other customers, kind of sparked off the back of our conversation, who are going through the same cycle now. They've got devices, they've known their end of certification, but like you say, the kind of traditional attitude around IP phones is they'll just tick along, right? And that isn't the case here. This change is going to actively stop them working.
And that was kind of our view as well. So our particular OEM, if you look on their website, it kind of alludes towards that the phones will be ended of support in 2027. So that's the OEM saying that they'll support it up to a particular date, even though they are end of sale or end of life. It specifies that there'll be some kind of support for at least 5 years after that date. So you kind of expect the device to carry on working. This particular message center article is going to effectively stop incoming notifications to those phones. And if you're a phone, you've got one job.
that's a pretty fundamental scenario, isn't it?
So if you're a phone, that's a bit of a problem if you can't receive calls. So we've had to quickly react and replace all of these devices just so we're covered.
And this is the kind of one of the challenges of an ecosystem philosophy. So Microsoft have many different vendors who can build devices, and they certify them with Microsoft, and that's great because it sparks innovation, price competition, all that kind of stuff. But the way this works is the OEMs build a device, Microsoft give them the application, they certify the device, and when they certify it for an Android device, based on the OS they put it on, so Android, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, now 13, Microsoft's current stance is it's from the date of release of the Android OS for 5 years the certification will last. So not based on when the device gets certified or when the OEM builds the device, but the build of Android is on it. So that means that although we say 5 years, if a device gets certified midway through that, so they get 2.5 years in because they've built it and they've whatever, you've only got 2.5 years technically of certified support between the OEM and Microsoft. Now, the device manufacturer can choose to put another version of Android on, recertify, and the clock starts again. But now the dependency for you as a customer is to understand, is the OEM going to do that? Will they get through certification? Is the chip in the device capable of going to the next 1-2 versions of Android? So you have to be quite technical in your decision making here and your understanding of the landscape to even work with an OEM. And then obviously you're quite deep on this, but like most customers are not as deep on this. They're just assuming I'm buying IP phones, they're certified. Presumably they're going to go for years and years and years.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. So if you are, when you are considering to purchase Android devices that run Teams, there's quite a lot you've got to look into, and there seems to be a lack of transparency and alignment between the OEMs and Microsoft. So, like you mentioned, you've got to figure out what the OEM support period is. You've got to ideally know what chipset or system of a chip is in that device, which is not published. You need to know
some OEMs will tell you if you ask. Some less so. So you have to kind of sniff around that as well.
And then on top of that, you've got to know what version of Android that chip can go to, and also predict what the future versions of Android that system can run. And then you've got to also look at how long Microsoft will certify that version of Android too. So there's a lot to take in and a lot to understand when choosing what you're going to be putting into your environment.
Yeah, and then Microsoft do say they'll do 2 years kind of best effort ongoing support. So they anticipate they won't try and break them. And to be fair to Microsoft, these older phones are Android 8 and 9, so they have hit their 5 year plus 2, but that sounds like they last 7 years, but it doesn't mean they do, because people might have bought them. Technically, you could go and buy them in the last couple of years and have only had them for 24 months potentially.
Well, yeah, that's the problem. In the Message Center article, it does say, what do you need to prepare? And it says, please review your current hardware inventory and identify devices that are reaching end of life or their certification expiration. Plan to upgrade these devices as soon as possible to ensure uninterrupted service. So if we now sort of switch from phones to conference rooms, which are a little bit more expensive, and you expect to get a fair amount of return on investment on these rooms, if even in Microsoft's store right now, you can purchase conference room devices that we know that won't go beyond Android 10, and that certification will expire next year. So you mentioned there, which is true, which Microsoft say they'll, after certification ends, they'll support it on a best endeavor kind of basis. But do you want to run that risk where, we're currently seeing now that Microsoft are depreciating the service, which is going to break some devices? Do you want to run that risk of having non-certified devices in your environment? It's something that's people need to figure out.
Definitely. And conference rooms is a really good conversation because, again, to bring everybody up to speed, it's the same philosophy on the Microsoft Teams rooms for Android. They're running Android OS. It's the same certification timeline, same certification dates. But as you say, you could now be spending multiple thousands and up, depending on what you buy. Again, particularly people in the AV space would typically assume those things run for years and years and years, but depending on when you hit and what your OEM's doing and the chipset, particularly if you're buying if you're actively uninformed, I have seen a customer get a really good deal on a whole load of, towards the end of their life cycle bars. They're like, great, we got these super cheap. I'm like, yeah, but they're not going very far. So is it worth it?
Yeah, because you've got to now also ask the OEMs when buying these, what's their commitment to support the newer versions of Android? Will they release a new firmware of a new version of Android if the device can support it? It's those questions that you need to ask now.
Yeah, and that puts them in a difficult spot sometimes because technically it's the Android open source project that chooses which chips are supported. So, like, they can't absolutely guarantee they can have a rough idea based on the chip they chose and the timeline. So, if you as a customer, which is what I would do if I was a customer, I'm buying 1,000 of these devices. I need a guarantee they're going to last it. But they can't really strict that. They can de-risk it, and I do see some of the OEMs doing things like guaranteeing swap out. So they're like, if for whatever reason it doesn't happen, we'll do a swap out. You've still got a project there, but at least you've got the kit covered. But yeah, it does make the conversation slightly harder.
Yeah, I think like I say, there needs to be better alignment with the OEMs and Microsoft, and to figure out what the life expectancy of products you're buying have.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there are things moving there. Nothing really to talk about in this pod, but with the MDEP, the Microsoft Devices Ecosystem Platform, Microsoft are getting into the Android OS game. So that's them taking the Android open source project and baking their own operating system around Android. It still has the same Android challenges of chipset support like any other Android, so it doesn't necessarily change the parameters in that respect. It might be interesting to see if that helps Microsoft and the OEMs work closer together to say we're jointly committing to this timeline potentially.
Yeah, I hope that does help this particular problem. Yeah, if they can support an Android version of things, kind of like freeze it to some extent, because they're going to be owning that code to some degree. If they can still provide security patches, for example, and have it running on older devices, then yeah, that should be the way forward. But who knows
Yeah.
if that's going to solve that problem though.
Yeah, and or potentially make it easier for the OEMs to jump versions because it's a big project for the OEMs to take on taking the Android 11. Typically, what the OEMs do is they'll skip a version as well because there's no sense in them. There's no customer value, particularly in jumping from Android 10 to 11. There might be some kind of minor features, but it's a big project for them to build it, test it, patch it, push it. So they might go, if they can, they'll go 9 to 11 or 10 to 12.
Yeah, that's why we
And
see current, fairly new devices on the market, which are still, they're running Android 10.
yeah, yeah, because they'll just hang on that until they have to go up to, and they'll try and jump straight to as high as they can go, basically.
Yeah.
So Dan, you were mentioning this has put you into kind of an interesting conversation, both on the phones and on the rooms front. On the phones front, looking at potentially, we've also got the SIP gateway in Teams World. So do you go standard space SIP phones that are compatible with SIP gateway? Because there are new SIP phones. You obviously miss out on some of the Teams features there, but does that give you a different life cycle?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So we've been using SIP Gateway pretty much as soon as it was launched. As I mentioned, most of these phones are common area, and we just want a basic phone with buttons. So SIP is a perfect candidate for that scenario. And yeah, the longevity, that takes the Android operating system out of the equation. It's then down to literally just, will Microsoft allow registration of these devices? Yes, great. And then it's over to the OEM to say we'll support it for 10 years or so. So then it does become, again, the phone becomes a bit of more of a consumable item, and you just replace it when it breaks.
Yeah. Have you asked the OEMs explicitly what their support timelines are for their SIP phones? Are they giving you that kind of timeline?
Yeah, some of them do. Yeah.
Awesome. And then rooms like BYOD has become less of an evil word in Microsoft land now. They've kind of acknowledged that is a scenario for some use cases in their world. Obviously, Microsoft Teams Room is still the premier experience, and BYOD is for other scenarios. But you've been thinking internally about potentially is there use cases because again, BYOD takes away that tight Android support timeline.
It's something definitely worth exploring. So, our philosophy in the past has always been we want our rooms as simple as possible. Don't need to bring a device in. You can just walk into the meeting and press the join button. That's a great experience to the end user, and everybody loves it. But yeah, if we're looking at these rooms are quite expensive, and if those life cycle terms are going to be reduced, then it's worth exploring different options in this space. It does feel like we're going a little bit of a step back in technology here. You have to bring your laptop in and plug it in, and also with the phones as well. We're going, Teams phones with the full experience to just push buttons. It's fine in most cases, but it does feel like it's a bit of a step back on the technology front.
What about Microsoft Teams rooms on Windows? Because obviously the timelines are slightly different there. Have you considered that? Is form factor a factor that you're?
Yeah, our initial rooms, it was only Windows back then, and yeah, they run well, and we are replacing some of those rooms already because they're getting towards 5 years now. But yeah, as soon as we introduced Android, it was kind of clear that this is kind of the way forward. It's much easier to manage the devices. You don't have loads of cables that are plugging into a compute. It's just a simple bar you hang on the wall, plug a screen in, pretty much off you go. So yeah, the ease and the barriers to entry with Android seem like, well, for us, for example, is the way forward, and was moving away from Windows to Android. But now we have to kind of rethink, what's our life cycle term for conference rooms, and can those devices support that?
It's good to understand. So for people listening, like, I guess there's some takeaways here. There's no silver bullet or answer here, but being aware of when you're purchasing these things, how Microsoft support timeline works, and then working with your OEM or distribution to understand what's the OEM committing to or estimating, what's their support timeline, what do they think they're going to get out of the chipset. Really important to understand, because and what the business / your team are accepting of is I definitely hear people now saying we're expecting 3 year, 5 year is acceptable for a refresh, but walking in knowing that's true as opposed to being surprised.
Yeah, another thing as well is make sure to check these message center articles and make sure you don't have any devices, especially phones, that could be impacted by this, because you need to react. And another thing to point out as well is, it says that these phones need to be on a quite a new Teams app version. So if those phones have not been receiving updates for a little while, in Teams Admin Center, the phones will say that they're all healthy and up to date, but they're not going to be able to take this newer version of the Teams app. So yeah, be warned there. So it's a bit of a catch out.
That's a really good highlight that I hadn't seen. I haven't got a tenant running the older phones, but it's not like they're on the tenant in the Teams Admin Center flashing saying we can't update, because they're as up to date as they can be, but they're not going any further, and that's the gap. So yeah, I'm sure that will catch people out. And you're right, the message center, we've got a few customers, and message center isn't front of mind for some of them in terms of Teams, but these really important messages around things like direct routing, you get lots of certificate changes and impacts there that people can easily miss if they're not careful. That's a really good tip. Great. Well, thanks for jumping on, Dan. Hopefully we've helped some people out, at least highlighting the awareness for this stuff. And maybe I'm going to revisit you if it's okay, because you're on this BYOD experiment at the moment, or kind of consideration. So maybe when you've come to some thoughts there, we'll do a show about the pros and cons of BYOD from your point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we're exploring, and I've got a laundry list of requirements that I would like to have for a BYOD experience, and yeah, struggling to find the right solution right now.
All right, well, there's the teaser, the BYOD show, because either you'll come to a conclusion and you'll pick something, or you'll decide that there aren't quite the right requirements, but either way, that'll be interesting.
Sure.
Brilliant. All right, thanks for jumping on, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.